coming back to the subject of suffering, and actually not just suffering, because Gurdjieff was saying, I mean, yeah, I want to make it more practical now, more practical about transforming suffering. And I like to just share some very important like tenets from Gurdjieff about suffering, and then give some tips of how to make use of it rather than be tortured in seemingly vain. Although even that is not really in vain. But so I'd like to go a little bit more practical here about this. So some powerful statements from Gurdjieff, I hope I remember them well. He was saying that if suffering didn't exist, it would need to be invented. No friction, no fire. He would also say that everybody suffers. Everybody you see have a lot of suffering, but they don't grow from it. They don't make conscious profit. They suffer in vain, you know, and they are not changing much through their suffering. I'm talking about the people that are not interested on the path. They are just regular, usual, mechanical, unconscious lives. There's still a lot of suffering, terrible suffering in the history of humanity. Actually, I was listening to David Hawkins. He was raised very religious as a kid. He was very, very religious, and then he became a psychiatrist. And in his early days, he was walking through the woods, and he hit him. He hit him the totality of the human suffering of all of mankind of all times. It hit him, and when it hit him, he became atheist. Because he had this distortion, like, whoa, like, so the God allowed that? I don't like this guy. This is not possible. So, you know, there was this misunderstanding that, you know, yes. So then he went into more depths and depths of suffering and despair and hell until he went back out of it. But
probably no one has been more misunderstood than God.
Yeah. Yeah. So Gurdjieff was saying that basically the moment you suffer, remember yourself and do the work. Yeah, do the work, apply the work. So I would say this, with unnecessary suffering, this kind of, you don't love me, nobody loves me, I'm not lovable, this all that, distortions. So this is more like, that's what we deal with at the beginning. At the beginning on the path, you come to a group, come working with me, most people, almost everybody, they deal with that. So the essential ingredient to diminish that is to become more conscious. Basically, one needs to be more aware and be less identified with these voices, and gradually see that this voice that says all this stuff in my head is not true. It's just not true. One needs to be more aware to see it rather than it being me, you know, so just witnessing and some kind of through the seeing and, you know, psychologically speaking, through some processing of where it comes from, one sees the distortion of a child. A child consciousness believes some lies for what happened there. So this can diminish like that a lot through being more aware, more self-observation, less identified with the mind. But as we go a little bit deeper, when we have heartache, hurt, sadness, loss, anyway, all the other emotions, the key ingredient and the primary obstacle is that we resist it. That's very important. We resist it. We don't want it. I don't want to feel this. I don't want, and then we try to escape it. We escape it with all kind of activities, substances, and pursuits. We avoid it, or we embroider it. Basically, even the embroidery is an avoidance of the actual bodily, energetic, feeling state. We escape it by going into the mind. The pain body goes in the mind, it keeps churning. So the essential ingredient is to become more awake. The moment there is suffering, to gradually have something on the dashboard like, wake up, man, wake up, be present now. And instead of being taken by the nose, to be more aware and start to be present to it, and to train oneself, which is very easy to say and hard to do, to not resist it and to let go trying to change it, to manipulate it, to justify it, to soothe it, it's a lot of psychological and even spiritual techniques are about avoiding suffering, are about trying to feel good and happy on top of ignorance and suffering. So that's very important to practice this, quieting the mind if possible, get more present and notice it. And as Francis would say, to welcome it, welcome the energy, the feeling. So in this way, it's like surfing it, witnessing it, allowing it. It's not going to make it go right away. You just need to get better, basically better at housing it. Our capacity to feel is very skinny for everybody I work with, everybody I know, unless they are deep on a spiritual path. It's like, I don't want this. So through various type of work, to be a bigger house where these visitors, as the Rumi would say, they are allowed, and we don't shut the door in the front of these unpleasant emotions. And this idea of that this suffering, this unpleasantness, actually, it is my child. It is my child coming from the woods that wants my awareness, my kindness, my loving acceptance, to accept it. Yeah. And ultimately this suffering, whether it's unnecessary or real, or it is actually God coming to us, basically, or the infinite field. It's a blessing, basically. That this is where hey, you need to look here, man. You need to look here. This is what blocks you. You need to look at it. And all humanity just doesn't want to look at it, and pointing fingers and trying to escape it and feel good.
And the reason, one of the words that came to me, you said, let's be practical, let's give tips. It's the word yield. And there are two ways you can yield to suffering. One is you, as Mihai is saying, to stop resisting and let it come into you. And let it pass all the way through you. And this is a painful process because it involves the purification we were talking about earlier. To let it come into you, and just say, okay, come into me, pass all the way through me. I'm going to yield. Now, of course, we're talking about serious suffering here. We're not talking about a bully who comes and that. We're talking about heavier suffering. Anyways, the other way to yield is to yield yourself to the suffering and say, I'm now going to let myself pass all the way through you. I yield myself. This is the idea of giving oneself to God. That's what that means, really. I'm going to yield. I'm going to now give myself over, and I'm going to pass through this force, this pressure, this heat of suffering, because I know it will bring purification, and I know it has the possibility to bring transformation, the transformation of consciousness. And so this is sort of the two doors to let it come into us, or to go into that door and give ourselves to what happens on the other side of that door. But interestingly enough, Christ said something interesting, or he's quoted in the Bible, or whoever wrote this said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, that can be interpreted different ways about the light. The burden is actually more consciousness, and that's not easy. That is a burden. My burden is light. On the other hand, it can mean my burden is easy. My burden is light. It's not much weight.
Yeah.
So you can think of it different ways. But what's interesting is when you get down to it, real suffering is an easier yoke to bear than unnecessary suffering. The ego is not an easy master. but suffering is. Suffering is actually an easy master if we yield to it. But the ego, it's not a good master, and it will forever trick us. And it's taking the low road each time to respond to difficulty with the ego. It's taking the low road, whereas what we're talking about is taking the high road. And what will often happen to people, or not often, but often, real suffering will come, and instead of the yielding that I was talking about, I can speak for myself too, we will respond from the ego. And we will take it personally. We'll feel sorry for ourselves. We'll blame. We'll hold on to it. We'll criticize. How are you doing? Well, I'm glad you asked. Not so good, my friend. Let me tell you. And you know what? Do you mind just complaining and doing all these things we do, all this unnecessary suffering? And it's torturous for us. And it's hard to give up. And why is this hard? Gurdjieff said nothing's more difficult for a man than to give up his imaginary suffering. Why? Because it entails giving up his imaginary idea of himself. That's what has to be given up. It's not that I am suffering terribly and I need to give up my imaginary suffering. It's I am my imaginary suffering. I, as this feeling of I am the cause of, if this weren't there, there'd be no suffering. If there were no, take the ego out of the equation when you're suffering unnecessarily, and it will disappear. Take the ego away from real suffering when it's occurring, the real suffering will remain, but it will lead to something else. And in this sense, suffering, both forms of suffering are a test of sorts. Not that someone's testing us, they are a measure, a barometer of our being in a given moment. How are we responding to something?